Welcome back to A Complete History of Manchester United. I'm Wayne Barton, author and producer of several Manchester United books and films, and I'm joined as always by the legendary Paddy Barclay. I've already said legendary before your name, so I don't know what qualifier to put. Very good former journalist and very good football writer. Of course, author of the definitive biography of Sir Matt Busby.
There it is. For those of you who are watching in video, that's the hardback cover of Sir Matt Busby, called the definitive biography in. So anyway, plug over, Wayne. Let's get on with what is going to be a fantastic Manchester United season, 1964-65.
Yeah. If you're watching the video, please give us a like and subscribe. And also you can join in the conversation in the comments section. If you're listening on the audio podcast, please be sure to subscribe. Give us a review on the platform you're listening on. Please, it really helps us. Anyway, 64, 65. But before it's not really a diversion from Manchester United. It's actually right about United. Sir Stanley Rouse, the FIFA president now. He'd been negotiating for United to travel to Malaysia and Far Eastern countries for the pre-season tour. But Malaysia were the only country were willing to meet a £1,000 per match guarantee, so the tour broke down. Even then, United's money-spinning trips to the Far East, Paddy, would be, they've become almost farcical in nature in most recent years. But this was part of this sort of globe-trotting exercise that Busby had really pioneered with these trips to America that we talked about earlier on.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, Busby and Rouse went back a long, long way. I think they first met when Rouse refereed a cup final in which Matt played for Man City, way, way long before the Second World War. And they shared an internationalist outlook on the world, which was very much at odds or ahead of the views of most club chairmen who thought that the league began and ended at the borders of England. Anyway, they worked together on getting Manchester United into that pioneering role of England in European competition. And now here again, Sir Stanley, as bigwig of the FA and of FIFA by now. He'd been in charge of the 62 World Cup as president. We're working on what, as you rightly say, is now a natural part of the Manchester United fixture list. Some huge series of games on the other side of the globe. But it didn't happen, Wayne. No.
No, I wonder what they would have made. I mean, considering both of them were such pioneers, I wonder what they would have made of the 39th game. And obviously talk about
that. Interesting, yes. That's a good one. Unfortunately, we can't bring them on to the podcast to discuss it. We can but speculate.
Yeah. United didn't go to Malaysia, but they got a summer trip somewhere less humid but no less hot, late trip in May to face Bilbao. And the pre-season should have been a 2-match tour of Germany. And they were due to play Hamburg and Bayern, but the friendly against Bayern was cancelled, so they rearranged this game to face Shamrock Rovers. And in that game, Paddy, there's a new name in Manchester United's goal, Pat Dunn.
Yes, they paid. He was 21 at the time, Pat Dunn. He'd obviously given United's excellent scouting in Dublin, going all back to the days of Louis Roca, and which produced Johnny Carey and so on. The Dublin scouting had always been good, and here was the latest one. Tony Dunn, with no relation, was already, as we discussed last week, already established in the team at fullback, and the equally young Pat Dunn, 21 years old, as I say. It wasn't a record fee for a goalkeeper, but that had been set for Harry Gregg. But it was 10,500, which is a fair fee, especially paid to an Irish club who generally tend to do business more easily than fellow English clubs. So it was a lot of money to pay. And it was assumed that he was one for the future, given that he was 21. However, so was Dave Gaskell. And Dave had a very poor start to what was generally a brilliant start to United's season. And so Pat Dunn was catapulted into the side after only 5 games in the reserves and did extremely well. In fact, at one stage, due not only to Pat Dunn's impressive goalkeeping, but to the general gelling of United's defensive and a key man, probably more important in United's excellent defensive record than Pat Dunn, was Nobby Stiles, who was himself only 22 at this time, but as the minder for Bill Fowkes, as English football morphed into a back four, the era of the back four. Nobby, of course, was to get great success as a defensive midfielder, but he saw it also as his job to mind the centre half in a back 3.5, if you like. But the fullbacks were already in place, Dunn on one side, Brennan on the other, and with Stiles doing even better than Morris Setters had in protecting, screening Bill Fowkes. At one stage, United conceded, in the first half of the season, conceded only 8 goals in 14 matches, all 13 of which were won and only 1 drawn. So 27 points out of 28 at one stage. Correct me if I'm wrong, Wayne, my arithmetic's not always infallible. And only 8 goals, 36 goals scored in those games, and only 8 conceded. So this is a very well drilled team. This is a team that has gelled and is going places.
Yeah, Cantwell only plays a couple of games. You mentioned Brennan and Dunn at fullback.
Yeah,
Cantwell only plays a couple of games. Setters a handful. You mentioned Stiles, Crerand. I mean, Stiles had been out of the side a little bit, and now, like I said, he's coming. He's played a very important role. A lot of competition of the team changing. Very interesting that you talk about Dunn and the goals conceded, because that's going to become a big feature of that. United barely kept clean sheets. I'm looking at the records, and this has been a little bit facetious, but you look at the fixture list this season, and you wonder if there's more clean sheets in this season than in the last sort of 18 combined. How many there are? It's ridiculous. Really, the comparison. But you mentioned, back 3.5, Stiles moving into that. A lot more defensive reliability.
Also, it's just occurred to me. Sorry to Wayne, but it's just occurred to me. Of course, you mentioned Crerand, obviously more famous as a creative player, the feed for the great forwards in front of him, but also a good tackler. So there's real solidity in that midfield section, as well as great flair.
Yeah, the season did start with difficulty with Gaskell in goal. 1 win in the first 6, which really gave no indication of what was to come. But then the changes made, a little bit more solid. They win 6 in a row. The last of which 5 in a row. Sorry, the last of which of that 5-win run is at Chelsea. And I mentioned this game because it's a game in which George Best is unbelievable. The United win 2-0, but midway through the game, Best is in the middle of the pitch and he just hits this back heel out of sheer arrogance, really. There's no need to do it, but it's like you've never seen anything like it. I think even the entire Chelsea defence, and he's not in a very dangerous position. He's sort of like middle of the Chelsea half, and he hits his back heel. It goes out wide to Aston, and he sets up low to score. Best I think he'd already scored earlier in that game. The headlines are all about Best and what he's done in this game. And I mentioned it in the last episode because you're talking about a player who, Best had only just come into the side, really, had only played half a season. But when while plugging, when I spoke to Paddy Cremon for the book that I wrote on George, he said, and it was Paddy obviously loves Manchester United, but he's not prone to hyperbole within confines of it. He wouldn't blow a player out of proportion in relation to another at United. And the way that he spoke about George, it was so stern that, obviously he was saying George was the best already, and he'd not even had a year in First Division football.
I think this is a point that needs to be stressed. Everyone, everyone who takes an interest in football, the history of football, knows that George Best's peak was all too short for reasons that we'll discuss in future episodes. What they don't maybe appreciate was how quickly his peak appeared. If you look at other players who basically make the turnstiles whir just by being on the team sheet. If you look at them through history, you look at Cristiano Ronaldo at Manchester United later. You look even at Lionel Messi at Barcelona. People who just changed the whole attitude of fans and make you just sit back and wonder at what you're seeing on the pitch. You will know, every United fan will know that Cristiano Ronaldo, was called a show pony for a bit and wasn't serious. He's got great talent, and if he could just harness it a bit better, and that went on for 3 years, something like that, before he became an undoubted world great player, and then you knew you were going to get something special pretty well every game. Likewise with Messi at Again, when Messi was Barcelona, he came into the team, came out, you knew he was going to be great, but again, it took 2 years. With George, as you've just said, it was a matter of months before he became, I must go and see that Manchester United because that kid Best is going to be playing. He really, and the goal that you've just talked about, the back heel that you've just talked about, one that I suspect you will talk about, which is a lob, is, these were things that were making the nation, and particularly the Old Trafford nation, gasp. Not just clap, but gasp.
Yeah. There's a couple of incidents as well of George in the FA Cup run, which I'll bring up in a moment. Another story about George after that win, 13 wins out of 14, includes a 7-0 win over Villa, 2-0 win at Anfield, 3-2 win at Arsenal.
Yeah.
The run ends with a 1-0 home defeat to Leeds. I mention it because Willie Anderson says a great story about George Best. He had such a kicking in the first half. He came off 2 or 3 minutes before half time with tears in his eyes. They weren't going to put him back on the pitch because he'd been kicked so violently. He had bruises all over him. Anderson said he had tears in his eyes. So everyone was expecting United would be down to 10 men in the second half. But George went out. He still got a kick in, but he went out and played the second half. And that was the first time Anderson, he'd gone through this youth system with him. He'd seen George at first hand. That's the first time he really noticed that George is saying, it doesn't matter what you do to me. You can kick me. I'm still going to come back at you. Remarkable bravery for a kid who was so small.
Very, very brave player. Of course, the greats tend to be. Maradona was a very brave player. Messi, irrepressible. Perhaps not as good at George's dishing it back out again as because George did get to the stage where he would have a go back. Not as in the period we're talking about. His bravery then was simply, pure courage rather than aggression. But yeah, you're quite right. He made it very, very clear that he wasn't going to be kicked out of his game by anybody. And so, in the era we're talking about, that required more courage even than it does now.
Yeah.
Because refereeing was much more lenient.
Yeah, as we journey through the series, we're going to see rule changes and how that actually impacts George's form, funnily enough. Yeah. Again, sticking with the theme of George, what we'll do is in this episode, maybe we'll talk about the league first, and then we'll do the cup runs after that. So we'll just continue the league over Christmas. So they had a sticky run of form over Christmas again, like the start of the season. But then they have this strong conclusion where they're securing not only a good run of wins, but some massive results and performances as well. And this is really Busby at his best, which is his foresight. The fact that he's created another team that has the bravery to take on all the top teams and play football in the way that he'd always wanted them to play, and they were picking up the results and they were winning. There's a win over Chelsea, a 4-0 win, which starts, as you mentioned, with this George Best goal. He's harassing Eddie McCready. He's harassing him for the ball. And this is a fullback. He doesn't know what to do. Everyone must have seen this goal. If you've seen anything about George Best, you must have seen this goal. McCready's in the right back position. He's terrified. You've never seen anything like it. A right back is terrified of the winger challenging him for the ball. Best robs him of it with the ferociousness of a Roy Keane or a Paddy Crerand. He robs the ball. Brunetti, when you look back at the footage, Brunetti's not even that far off his line. He comes out a little, but he's thinking, no, I'll be a little bit cautious here.
He was well positioned, the goalkeeper.
Yeah, and George is on the sort of left-hand side. He darts in a little. I don't know where he's seen the space because nobody else can see it, but he lofts the ball over Brunetti into the far corner. It's outrageous what he's done.
How many times do you see footballers that they can do everything, but it's the finishing where the pressure is on? You look at that finish by George Best, and you would think he was playing with some cones alone on a public park with nobody watching. He was ice cold. There was nothing else mattered. He just didn't recognize pressure, the performance pressure, George.
Yeah, Brunetti might as well not have been in the goal. The way that he's hit it,
and you can't blame the keeper. He was in exactly the right position, and you're quite right. They may as well not have had a keeper.
Yeah, honestly, if you haven't seen it, it is at that point in Old Trafford history. You're going like sort of 60 years of Old Trafford history. That must have been probably the most outrageous goal seen at the stadium. The way in which he takes the goal. Because we've been talking about great goals, and the thud of the leather, like from Duncan Edwards or Bobby Charlton smashing them into the net, but nothing like this.
In later years, Rooney volleys and overhead kicks and all that. But for sheer artistry, for the wow factor, everything has to be measured against that one.
Yeah.
Even some of Ronaldo's trademark, self-invented free kicks, would struggle to compete with that as the most wow goal ever scored.
Yeah,
at Old Trafford.
United gone to win 4-0. The other scorers in that game. David Hurd scores a couple. Dennis Law, obviously Dennis Law scoring all the time again. I'm just going to read the match report of that game.
Before you do, when was that game?
The game is played 13th of March.
Because no wonder Dennis is back in goal scoring form, because he got suspended just before Christmas like he usually did. So he went back to Aberdeen for his Christmas holiday. Dennis invented the mid-season break. Did you know that? He got sent off for swearing at a referee, and he was fearing 6 weeks, but he told a little porcupine about what he'd called the referee. He called him he claimed at the disciplinary hearing that he called the referee a silly coot. Well, the word he actually used did begin with C, but it was a different word. But the disciplinary committee had enough doubt in their minds to give him 28 days instead of the expected 6 weeks.
Yeah, United's skullduggery in front of the suspension committees would.
And Matt Busby colluded in it. In fact, he drove Dennis Law and his chief witness for the defence, Paddy Crerand. He drove them over the Pennines to the hearing in Sheffield. And by the way, just as an aside, Dennis and Paddy Crerand, many years later, used to laugh about that journey because Sir Matt was apparently the worst, not the fastest, but the worst driver in the whole of Manchester, in fact, possibly in the whole of England. And he drove the car over to Sheffield. And the boys told me that they had their eyes closed all the way there and all the way back. Anyway, carry on.
No, the nature of it all will be familiar when we get to there's another incident with George Best where they pull the wool over the committee's eyes in similarly farcical fashion. We just couldn't imagine it happening. It's like a carry-on sketch, but
It
yeah.
does,
The People's Match report of the Chelsea win. Genius, it seems, still will not answer to numbers. No, the sort of genius personified by Lowe, Best, Charlton and company. Soccer purveyors extraordinary of Manchester United. To say Chelsea were outwitted, outmatched, outfought is to put it mildly. They were outclassed. Men they could never mark. Those United players always seem to have a trick too many up their sleeves, caused as much confusion among the Chelsea numbers brigade as a stuttering call would at a bingo session. 2 days later, Fulham travel to Old Trafford, and they're expected to get massacred. Basically, United they could have, and United didn't let anyone down, only scoring 4. But the match report said that they could have scored a dozen in the first half alone.
Yeah.
There was 5 corners in the first 6 minutes, and even in that first 5 minutes, Fulham found time to score themselves. But United came back and won. They won at Leeds.
It's good that you found those cuttings because they do bring back. I can just about remember that era, and they bring back very much the sense that just as in earlier episodes we talked about the great Donny Davis and George Follows, the journalists of the time, suddenly realizing that the Busby babes were materializing in front of their eyes and writing so lyrically about it. This was the journalists of the next generation spotting the Law Best Charlton factor, the glamour factor at Old Trafford, the beauty, the appeal to the imagination, and all of that is in those reports we've just read.
Well, this one, while we're plugging, this one isn't going to be my book, but these match reports from this season are taken from this book, which is Champions Again by Ralph Finn. This kind of book is pretty hard to come by these days, but the reports from this season are in that book. They're not all of them, but there's some really good ones in there. And like I said, sports writing still great. United smash Fulham, looking like they win the title. They go to win. They go to Leeds and win. They win 3-0 against Liverpool in a ferocious game ferocious not in terms of battling, but the way that United are dogging it. They really want this win. Sam Leach of the Sunday Mirror says, I've not seen such a fierce will to win from an English side since the Spurs heyday of 1960. And it's interesting because it does evoke those earlier days of when we talked about Jimmy Murphy being relentless with the kids, like saying, Nantwich Town in the Youth Cup and they've got to keep persevering. Now there's a nucleus of these young lads in the side again, and the attitude is back in the same way. I don't think that's a coincidence at all. I think it's...
No, Styles, Crerand, Law, these are, I was going to say, these are not gentlemen on the field. These are people who, were ruthless, were ferocious, and of course George the same, who would fight fire with fire. In fact, they would start a fire. And there they are. One thing we haven't mentioned yet, actually, we did mention it towards the end of the last episode. The picture that's up on the screen now shows an unfamiliar face in the position usually adopted in team photographs by the right winger. This was John Connelly, who, as we mentioned in the last episode, Busby had raised a lot of money by selling players who weren't going to come to reach the standard that Manchester United required. And John Connelly, who definitely was, he'd been a key member of Burnley's title-winning side, a fantastic two-footed goal-scoring winger. And he'd come for £56,000 and was an instant hit. In fact, he and Best, contrasting wingers, were really fundamental to the style of this new United. Interesting to note that at this time, Nobby Stiles was promoted to during this season was promoted to the full England team by Sir Alf Ramsey, and Sir Alf Ramsey and Matt had fundamentally disagreed on the philosophy of football. Ramsey identified that wingers were a dying breed. Busby refused to accept that. And indeed, so ingrained was this philosophy, not only into his mind, but into the bricks and mortar of Old Trafford, that the great Sir Alex Ferguson pursued the same thing throughout his career. Um, but here's an example of it. As the coaching fraternity are beginning to wonder, are wingers really? Matt Busby said, I don't care what you say. And there were Connelly. He paid 56 for Connelly, and George Best. There were his wingers. Bad news, by the way, for Ian Moyer, who we've mentioned in recent episodes. He was to be sold to Blackpool for a very useful £30,000, and for the Willie Anderson, who you mentioned a few times. These two, because of the success of the Connelly Best axis, if you like. All of these had become peripheral and were no longer to play much part in Manchester United's future.
But again, while they weren't, it shows the sort of returning health of the youth system, which has struggled for a couple of years because of what happened with Munich. So now Jimmy's back in place doing the work with the.
And United were champions of youth football. They'd regained the FA Youth Cup, and where they was it in the
64 where they
64. That's right. Now in that team, 8 players of that youth team went on to get into the first team. I put them down on my list. Obviously, George Best was one. David Sadler, who we paid tribute to his early career in previous episodes. Those were 2 of them. Bobby Noble, the magnificent talent fullback, could play right back or left back, but would have been probably England's left back for 10 years, according to David Sadler's reflections later. But for misfortune, he was in that team. John Aston Jr. was in the team. Jimmy Ryan, another winger, was in, and friend of George Best, was in the team. I'm just trying to see my list. If I missed anybody out, there's one that you are going to refer to at some stage, who probably didn't become as famous as most of the others, and that was Albert Kinsey. Ben, you'll be describing him at some stage in this episode, I'm sure. Oh, the others, and also I bet you have a word to say about John Fitzpatrick, another member of that team, and also the goalkeeper Jimmy Rimmer, who's to go on and have a very good career too. 8 of them, so 8 out of that team got into the Manchester United first team. No wonder everybody agreed this was the best youth team since the Busby days.
Yeah, spoke for itself. And influenced by that, United cruised almost to the league title. I said relatively cruised. The game which decided it was against Arsenal, not mathematically, because of the goal average situation, which we'll talk about in a moment. But United were aggressive again against Arsenal and won 3-1 on the day. An emotional day.
They didn't. They didn't think that at one stage it didn't look like they were going to need to win, because the only other team that could have won it was Leeds. Now with Johnny Giles and doing very, very well, albeit maybe a little bit rough in their tactics, but they were to reach the FA Cup final this season, and in fact, a lot of people thought that the fact that Leeds had beaten United in the semis, I think, Wayne, correct me if I'm wrong there,
Did. Yeah.
And because of that, United faced teams, including that Liverpool one, who were sort of had half an eye. I don't know why I'm touching my ear, because I meant to touch my eye. They had half an eye on the cup final, maybe an ear on the crowd, but it helped United. Leeds were 3-0 down at Birmingham on the night that Old Trafford was watching the Arsenal game. Leeds were 3 down. So if that got through on the old transistor radios, United could have relaxed. They didn't. Best scored the first, I think.
Yeah.
Law then got 2. Law now regal in his mastery of the striker's art. And that was it. Old Trafford could celebrate. And as you said, a very emotional night, Wayne.
Yeah, if you're watching on the video, then you're seeing the celebrations of the title with Bill Foulkes holding the trophy in front of some of his colleagues there. Yeah, Di Stefano and Puskas were in attendance at Old Trafford, Paddy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Busby was greeted by them, and he made an emotional comment to the press after the game. He said, "In this moment, I remember those dark days. I remember the boys who played so brilliantly for us and looked like conquering the world. Now we have risen from the depths and are right back where Manchester United belong. The boys who were at Munich would have been really proud of them on this memorable night." Really, obviously, poignant comments. But you had like the likes of George Best. Yes, obviously, at the moment where a few people like Busby would have been looking back and paying tribute. You had Best saying, "Oh, it's always been my ambition to play in the European Cup." So they're already looking forward, a few of these players, as well they should. Another picture from the celebrations. You can see that that's Matt Busby tipping a bottle of champagne, and it's worth it just for the caption alone, which I'm going to read to you. It says, "Matt Busby pours champagne for Pat Crerand, Pat Dunn, Shea Brennan, Dennis Lowe, John Kennelly, and David Hurd. George Best, right, had lemonade." Well,
he was to change his habits as the years went by, better and become a famous imbiber of champagne and among other things. But at that time, Jimmy Ryan, who was his friend, recalled that basically George would have a small bottle of beer and really probably only drink half of it over the course of an evening out. In fact, that was one of the things that drew Jimmy and George together. They were both, they didn't really have much of a taste for alcohol at that time. Interesting. So George said, "No, thanks. I won't have that. I'll have a glass of lemonade instead." Yeah, that's great. But he was about a very much a fundamental part of why the rest of the boys were drinking champagne. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. United win their 6th league title because the win over Arsenal means that as long as they avoid a 19-0 defeat at Villa Park in the final league game, they'll be champions. They actually lose 2-1, but it's inconsequential in the end. Really, the point, well, inconsequential because other than it would have made the defensive record look even better than this. Because we've talked about conceding 70 goals, 80 goals in a league campaign, 60 goals, stuff like that. This time round, 39 goals conceded, which is obviously miserly in comparison to the other teams.
Less than a goal a game.
Yeah, and many clean sheets in there as well, especially considering the rocky start where they shipped a lot of goals in the first 5-6 games. They come close to getting into 2 cup finals as well. Again, they're not in the League Cup, but they're in the FA Cup. They get to semi-final, as Paddy said, being eliminated to Leeds after it was a replay, but obviously very violent affair in the couple of games. But earlier in the cup run, it's still eventful. Some really memorable moments with George Best against Burnley in the 5th round. United are a goal down. There's 10 minutes left. George Best's boot comes off and he's trying to get it back on, but he's struggling and the play's going on. It's frenetic. Old Trafford is demanding a late winner. So George is like, "I can't put it on. I'm just going to have to keep playing without it." So he's carrying the boot in his left hand. He runs someone passes him the ball. He runs to the box, sets up a goal for Dennis Lowe. You're thinking, "Oh, that's great. That's brilliant. We'll keep playing." Apparently the ball... He crosses it. It's a defender, flies up in the air. Dennis Lowe, an acrobatic overhead kick, and flies in. Best thinking, "I can't get the boot back on," throws it to the crowd, thinking, "I'll just get rid of it." The crowd, well-meaning as they are, throw it back. So he's still playing with the boot in his hand. Play kicks off. The ball comes again to Best, who sets up another goal, this time for Paddy Crerand. This is an incredible story because apparently the referee shouldn't have allowed him to play on. So instead of marveling at the incredible genius of what they've witnessed, everyone was calling out the referee afterwards, and he was saying, "Oh, well, I wasn't quite sure what the rule was. I was telling him to get it back on, but the play was moving so fast that I couldn't do anything about it."
But I didn't know. I must admit, I didn't know that it's against the laws of the game to play without boots. I had no idea.
And that in itself is a story that would be good enough for a season, but not with George Best. There's another one in the FA. It's incredible, and you feel sorry because it's this is the kind of contribution that you think destiny is going to reward him with the cup final, and it really should have done. As you mentioned Jimmy Ryan and George Best are pals. On the morning of a trip to Wolves in the FA Cup, Jimmy Ryan wants some comp tickets, and George says he can have his. So he says, "But meet me at the Cliff to get them, and then we'll travel down after." So when he goes to see George at the Cliff, George is training by himself, and what he's doing is he's on the corner and he's just kicking the ball into the net. He's trying to curve it from the corner into the net. And Jim's watching him, and he's like, "What is he doing? What is he coming up with next? Why is he doing this? You can never do it in a game." And then they got to Molineux. It's the heat of a cup game. Obviously, Wolves, big rivals of United over the years. It's a massive atmosphere at Molineux. Heat of the battle. And in fact, by the way, we should mention George's previous inspiration. He'd watched those old Wolves games that we've talked about. The Wolves where they played Honved in the European friendlies. And when they'd had the games on television, the commentators were speaking about the gold shirts that Wolves were wearing. So he was enamoured by this and the idea of playing against European football. So Wolves were quite close to George Best, and now he was finally playing at Molineux at the stage. He goes over to take a corner. Jim Ryan says, "I can't believe what I'm watching. He's watching the same thing now again." George takes the corner, goes for the near post and gets it in the near post. So good, in fact, that the Pathé News clip that picks it up, they've got him taking the corner, but they missed. I'm just checking the score here because no, he doesn't. The Pathé News clip makes it look like George Best is running onto George Best's corner to finish it. It's ridiculous, but he scored direct from the corner. And Jim Ryan couldn't believe what he was watching. He was literally watching what he'd seen in the morning take place on the evening. This is the kind of ingenuity.
That's what we were saying before. George was impervious to pressure, crowd pressure, personal pressure. He was impervious to that.
Yeah. And he was literally telling his teammates that he would try these new things. He was telling them that, I'm going to try something new. And they were like, oh, all right, whatever. I don't think Jim would have believed, if he had not been there to witness it himself, that George had been trying it that morning. He would have probably just thought it was a fluke. And that was the level of the genius that he had, that he would know he was planning it and he did it. His execution was just extreme. But unfortunately, the magic doesn't make it all the way to Wembley. United are eliminated to Leeds, and then it's the same story in the intercities.
I'll give you another little vignette from the replay. Imagine that for a moment that you're Bobby Charlton, and the game is a rough one. You're quite right. It's probably the beginnings of Leeds and Manchester United being almost unable to play a civilized game of football, either on or off the field. And so you're Bobby Charlton, and all sorts of mayhem's going on. And suddenly a brawl starts up between your brother, Jack, and your teammate, Dennis Law. So whose side are you on? Do you hope your brother wins it or your teammate? I think probably, football being football, he'd be on Dennis's side against Jack. But That was one wonderful image from that game of Dennis and Jack Charlton at each other's throats.
Yeah, United eliminated in the replay. Also takes a semi-final replay to knock them out of the Intercities Fairs Cup, where they got to Ferencváros. United wanting to impress in Europe after the embarrassment of Sporting Lisbon in the previous season, but they're at least softened by the blow that they'll be competing in the European Cup in the following season.
Yeah.
So sixth league title for United.
Yeah, it was interesting that, just to dwell briefly, if I may, on the Ferencváros match. It went to 3 matches.
Yeah.
Ferencváros won the toss for the third game. This is the final of the Fairs Cup, the forerunner of the Europa League, and so Ferencváros won the toss, so that they had advantage in the third game, and they won it. But one feature, vital to Manchester United's history off the field, was that the chairman, who'd been through so much with Matt, Harold Hardman, now 83, had died, and he'd been taken over. The chairmanship had been taken over by Louis Edwards, who himself had very quietly and cleverly bought his way into a majority position on the United board by buying the shares of Alan Gibson, son of James Gibson, the very, very significant chairman of the past. So it was now a new era off the pitch, as well as a developing era, as well as a great team appearing on the field.
Yeah. Let's go through the squads then. Pat Dunn, these are the new players that are in. So Pat Dunn, obviously, the goalkeeper, we've already spoke about him. Previously, he'd been with Everton. He'd even had a trial at United prior to that. It was deemed that he wasn't tall enough. Remember that we talked about the height of goalkeepers. That was now becoming an important thing. Pat Dunn had one arm shorter than the other. But just the little things that you pick up when you're looking back at United history.
Yeah.
He did show a lot of promise, and Busby was only too happy to go back and admit that he'd made an error, a rare error in not identifying this player in the first place, and signed for £10,500 and added the stability that Gaskell unfortunately did not. Gaskell.
But what is his first season in England?
Yeah,
Win the title. Amazing.
55 appearances for Dunn, 37 in the league. Gaskell made 5 league appearances, you already mentioned, Paddy. Shea Brennan, now established at right back, 60 appearances every single game, 42 in the league. Tony Dunn on the other side, 60 appearances, 42 in the league. They're just there all the time. Bill Foulkes in the back line, 60 appearances, 42 in the league, every single game. That back line.
Doesn't stability help, eh?
Well, he certainly did for Manchester United this season. Nobby Styles, when we get to him, 59 games, 41 in the league. So, yeah, that's the 3.5 that you mentioned there. Noel Cantwell, just 2 appearances and 1 goal in the league before he was moved on. Mentioned Bill Foulkes already. Maurice Setters, just 5 appearances, and it was 5 in the league, 6 in all competitions. And that brings us on to Pat Crerand as well. Can't forget Pat. 5 in 57 in all competitions, 3 in 39 in the league. So the only 3 games he missed were in the league. And that brings us on to John Fitzpatrick, a wing half, half back, full back, midfielder. He played in a multitude of positions for United from Aberdeen. One little story he's got in common with Ruud van Nistelrooy. He was due to sign for Manchester United, but he agreed to play one last game for his lads club. And in that game, he broke his leg, and he delayed his arrival. United were still good on signing him, and they agreed to that just a little bit later in the summer of 1962. He really did fit in with that group of young lads, the likes of Willie Anderson and George Best.
Yes,
because they were athletic, they were combative, they all pushed each other on. They were all a great group of lads, and he was obviously very hugely popular as well. Very funny guy. John Fitzpatrick, part of that youth cup winning team, and with Setters and Canwell on the way out, it was a huge show of faith in Fitzpatrick actually that he was the one who got these. Well, he played how many games have I got? Just 2 games this season, but he was the one next in line.
But bear in mind, he'd been in the youth team that won the Youth Cup. So, yeah, I mean, but you mentioned that his misfortune he had that delayed his signing for United. He was to be, oh God, he was an aggressive player, but he took as much as he gave, unfortunately, and it was his career, I think, if you was definitely affected by an injury proneness.
Yeah, they would. I'm not comparing John to Brian Robson, but one thing that some people have often told me about Brian Robson is he was so good that he sometimes went into challenges you wouldn't want him to go into,
Yeah,
just to prove the point. And I think that's sort of similar to John Fitzpatrick.
yeah,
Maybe he got not carried away or influenced by, but that you've seen Crerand, you've seen Lowe give as good as they get on the pitch. You're
yeah.
obviously going to be influenced by that.
Well, there must have been something in the Sierra Aberdeen when John and Dennis Law were growing up in that city because they were both as fiery and dare I say it, rash as each other.
Yeah, I don't know where the story will come into, so I'll just drop a small anecdote about John. I was lucky enough again to interview him for the book I wrote on George, and he passed
Nice
away
guy.
a few months after that. And I talked about it on social media about John, and I wrote a small thing that I published on my website about his career and how he deserves a little bit more credit. We'll talk about his unique place in United history in future episodes as well. And his family actually got in touch and asked if they could read what I'd written out at his funeral. And it's honestly one of the strangest honours that you can have, as someone who writes and follows United, to have something like that. And so, and he was.
There is no better tribute than that his family wanted it to be read out. That it really is a huge privilege.
No, it really, really was, and he offers a lot of these players as we won't really be talking about because we're talking about them as players in their playing days, but a lot of them suffered from dementia and Alzheimer's, and John was unfortunately one of those. When I talked to him, he was in complete lucidity. He had a day where he was really good, and his memories of George obviously I was talking to him about George in the youth team, and he provided some of the best stories. He was absolutely unbelievable, and a massive character.
He was a massive character. Jimmy, I don't know if we have time now for me to tell it, but Jimmy Ryan tells some wonderful stories about John Fitzpatrick and of I don't know if it must have been around this time. Maybe now isn't the time, but it must have been around this time that United went to America. Was it in the next season?
It could well be.
One we're discussing. And basically, Fitzpatrick wound Jimmy Ryan up and said, look, I've heard that the first team lads are getting huge expenses on this tour, and we ought to go and see Busby, and we've played for the first team. Why can't we get more expenses, So Jimmy doesn't really fancy going in to demand more money from Busby, because as well as respecting him, they were scared stiff of him. So, but John Fitzpatrick keeps winding him up, and eventually they knock on Busby's hotel room in America. They've just arrived. And Busby comes to the door in a dressing gown, and he says, boys, come in. We want a word. And John Fitzpatrick says, yeah, we want a word. And then nods to Jimmy Ryan, expecting him to do it. And of course, Jim with thought that Fitzpatrick saying, yeah, we're just going to tell the boss what's what. We deserve this money. And suddenly he's to do it, so he starts stumbling and bumbling, and eventually Busby tells him not to be so stupid and get out of his sight. But that was Fitzpatrick. He was he was a character, and Jim was very, very fond of him. It's another very close friend of Jimmy Ryan, and as indeed all of those youth team boys were. There was a wonderful atmosphere among them. John Aston Jr., they all speaks so fondly of those happy times as they graduated from the youth towards the first team.
Yeah. George Best, 14 goals in 59 appearances, 10 in 41 in the league. I think we probably waxed lyrical about all 14 of them in this episode.
Yeah.
Bobby Charlton, 18 goals in 59, 10 in 41 in the league, just like George. David Hurd, 28 in 55, 20 in 37 in the league. We already talked about John Kennelly earlier in the episode. Obviously, he'd been a major part, as Paddy said, of Burnley's title success. In 1960, I actually had doubts about his future in the games, severe enough that he applied for a job as a joiner when he was a teenager and was taking the apprenticeship before he was offered a career at Burnley. At United, he struck up an instant rapport with Bobby Charlton playing on the left-hand side of the pitch. He actually described Charlton as the best player he'd ever played with. Busby really had stumbled on a bit of gold here with Kennelly. You know, he was a little bit different in style to Best. Everyone was. But he shared that appetite to work hard and retrieve the ball. So when you've got Charlton and Lowe, who like Charlton had the desire to find space, Lowe had this inclination to drop deep, and Best would go everywhere. United had this multifaceted front line who would drift around, but in Kennelly and Best, they would also work hard to retrieve the ball. So yeah, it's a really massive bit of gold here that Busby had stumbled on, and this dynamic in the front line. Kennelly played every game this season, 60 games, 20 goals, 15 in 42 in the league, a massive contribution to the league title. John Aston Jr., son of Senior, of course, we talked about him in the previous episode, a left winger, left-footed, backup for Kennelly, basically. So he only played one single game this season. And another Youth Cup winner who will, I'm sure, be someone that we talk about significantly in the future. Aston, fantastic youth talent. Brings on to the other forwards. Ian Moy, you already mentioned him, one single appearance before he's moved on this season. And David Sadler, 1 goal in 6 games in the league. Less of a contribution this season than his breakthrough season. One single appearance for Albert Kinsley. How many players can you say have played for Manchester United and have scored as many goals as they played games? I looked through the records and I think Albert Kinsley is the only one. So he's got a 100% goal scoring record. And every time he scored, Paddy, it was a match winner as well. The only thing is, it was the one game. It's the FA Cup game against
that's a record it'll take some beating.
I don't think it will be. So it will never be beaten unless in present day someone does that. But that's remarkable. But it's his own little place in history. Liverpool born forward. Brings us on to the tactics. You already mentioned there that it's a 3.5 with Styles dropping back now. Bobby Charlton probably dropping back to provide a little bit of stability in midfield as well, with Creren, the metronome, making everything work in there. And that front line that just moves everywhere by itself. Hurd probably the most static, and everyone else just plays everywhere.
Yes. Funnily enough, we haven't mentioned Hurd, but somebody had to do a job for the team, and yes, he was less of a roamer than the others were. Law would often slot in behind him. So, although you wouldn't exactly say it replicates Brazil's 4-2-4, it's definitely, heading in that direction. And of course, thereby taking on the frame of the football that we were to know between, 1960, late 1960s and almost to the present day.
Yeah, absolutely. The United review is still the same with the handshake on the front, and we're still not sure which hand is shaking which. The attendance dropped slightly to 44,886. Dennis Lowe, by the way, maybe I didn't talk about Dennis Lowe because why wouldn't I? 39 goals in 52 games, 28 in 36. So 46 in the previous season, 39 in this one. It's ridiculous. Stop scoring, Dennis. It's too many. United's colours, red, white, and red socks, as they were in the previous episode, all white away strip with the red socks, and a third strip for the first time in United history. Those Edwards bringing in the commercial changes, although they weren't yet for sale. These kits, they wore a blue shirt with white shorts and socks. Funnily enough, it's I think one of the first outings of it was the picture that was taken for the cover of True Genius, with George Best on the front. First outings of that blue kit.
Oh my goodness. You're shameless, Wayne. Imagine getting in a plug like that. So
I've dropped about 3 in since you started. I'm like wildfire, going everywhere with them. Notwithstanding the library that I've got behind my shoulder as well.
We did notice. Yeah, go on.
The key results, they achieved the double over Liverpool and Arsenal, but I think the Chelsea results really are with the league defining win over Arsenal at the end, because obviously that's the one that delivers the league title. But the way in which they played against Chelsea, and the way in which the Chelsea United game was about to become a glamour fixture, in spite of the fact that Chelsea had some hard men in the team, one of the glamour fixtures in football. The way that United approached both of those games was incredible. Elsewhere in football, Busby had predicted that Leeds would win the FA Cup because of how well they'd pushed United in the league, but Liverpool actually won the final for the first time ever. Chelsea won the League Cup. Newcastle were promoted to the First Division. West Ham, a European trophy at Wembley, win the European Cup Winners' Cup. We'll talk about some departures now, names that we mentioned before. Stanley Matthews, who was at his prime in the first years of this entire series, finally retires at the age of 50 years and 5 days. And probably a more significant departure to the narrative of this series, Paddy, was Stan Collis, who was left his job in September at Wolves.
Yes. I mean, this obviously was a terrible blow for Collis. And it also hit Busby hard because, he was a wartime friend of Collis's. They were great rivals. Busby had won, in terms of their rivalry, Busby had just won his 4th title. Collis was on 3. It was the first time, I think, probably that Busby had been ahead of Collis in the series, in this heavyweight managerial contest. But because they were such friends, the loss of Collis's sacking hit Busby hard, and he wrote what in terms of Busby's language was a very strong letter in which he said it's not my faith in human nature. You've given your lifeblood for this club, and this is how they repay you. And they were friends, and Collis was never to get a chance again to box at the heavyweight level with Busby, because although he later did make a return to management with Birmingham City, it was not comparable with what he built at Wolves. And just to show about the sort of the friendship towards the top of the division, 2 fellow Scots were among Busby's rival now. We've mentioned Bill Shankly last. Is at Liverpool, and also Tommy Docherty. We talked about, beating Chelsea was quite a thing. That was because Tommy Docherty had built a wonderful young team. So they were people that Busby knew, and also another of his wartime friends, Joe Mercer, unfortunately hadn't done all that well. Had lost his job at Aston Villa during the season. But guess what? He got another job. And in fact, it enabled him to move into the house just round from the Busbys in Charlton cum Hardy, Manchester, because the new manager of Manchester City was Joe Mercer.
Yeah, Scottish influence, certainly, and Joe coming along there as well. Inter Milan won the European Cup against Benfica. Inter, we talked about tactics earlier on and the evolution of that. Inter were deploying their brand of Catenaccio, which was a very defensive brand of football, playing with 3 defenders and more than 3.5, like 4.5.
Yeah.
And finally, the match of the day was first broadcast as well in this season, August 1964, right at the start of it. I think Liverpool and Arsenal was the game shown on that.
Yeah.
If you're watching this video, then please give it a like and subscribe. Join in the conversation in the comment section. If you're listening to the audio podcast, please be sure to to subscribe and listen and give us a review on the platform you're listening on. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next time.